Welcome to Trending in Education. This is Mike Palmer. I'm joined today by Eric Stano, who's the Vice President of Consulting, Curriculum, and Product Strategy at Magic EdTech. We're going to be talking about what's his job been like, what's his life been like as the world has been transformed lately with AI. We'll talk about that in a bit. Before we get to any of that, Eric, welcome to Trending in Education.
Oh, thanks, Mike, for having me.
It's great to have you. You have an interesting background. You've been working in e-learning and educational technology and content development for many years. Rather than me talk about it, can you catch our listeners up on who you are and how you got to this point in your professional life?
Yeah, so I've been in educational publishing and product development and e-learning in the last 20 years, really for my entire career. Since graduating college, leaving college, I entered the education space. So I basically never left college. And I've always been in the sphere of content acquisition, development, curation, and publication. I was variously an acquisitions editor, an editor in chief, editorial director, and then
Mhm.
as I moved more into the e-learning space, product director and such. So
Yep.
I've spent my entire career really managing and developing the content for students of all types, regardless of grade level, regardless of discipline. I've pretty much touched it all over my 30 years.
Yeah. And I was stalking you a little bit on LinkedIn coming in. You have some interesting companies that you worked at. I saw Pearson and Knewton, both of whom I think are top of mind for folks. Lately, you've been now working with Magic EdTech. Can you talk more about who Magic EdTech is and what they're trying to do?
Yeah, Magic EdTech is a digital services provider to the sphere of educational publishers, EdTech companies. We provide digital services. Really, the way I characterize it is anything digital that a company like a Pearson, like a McGraw-Hill, or like a Newton wants to accomplish but is unable to accomplish with their internal resources. We can partner with them and accomplish that for them. So we're really a partner in that way.
And then your title, I think, spells this out a little bit too, consulting, curriculum, and product strategy. That is a nice trifecta there, where how do those things kind of relate? Where I do imagine as you work with different clients, I've certainly noticed this since I left Kaplan, where I was also doing similar work for 20 years, is that you're learning more of what's going on across the industry when you're working in that consulting capacity, and then consulting as it relates to curriculum and product strategy. It's almost like that was one thing in the before times, pre November of 2022. And then since November of 22, everyone now who's thinking about curriculum and product strategy has a new tool in our toolbox, which is generative AI. I think that's where we wanted to go a little bit deeper in this conversation is, what's that been like? How has that disruption kind of been felt both by you and also the types of projects and strategic thinking that you're seeing emerging around the intersection between content development, e-learning, and AI?
Right. Well, a lot to unpack there. Let me step back a little bit and just sort of break down the various quadrants of my gig. We're actually a consulting company writ large. What we want to do is because most of us have been around this industry for a good number of years. What we want to do is always partner with our clients and really help them solve problems and figure out the best, most efficient way to do that, the most innovative way
Yep.
of doing that, obviously with an eye toward digital solutions. Product strategy is really born out of the fact that, as an editor in chief, editorial director, my role for all of those years was really to conceive of new products relative to problems that I would see in the educational marketplace. What is a blocker for folks? What are
Yep.
folks struggling with? And how do we solve that? And my team would often conceive of new products and figure out the right way to create them and where they fit in the marketplace and really how to make them successful. So what I do by virtue of that experience is I partner with others who are doing the same thing and help them. I'm a fresh set of eyes
Yep.
on that particular problem. When it comes to curriculum, which is bringing us to really the subject of today, again, as I said, I have always been involved in the development, the acquisition and the development of the content that students are going to
Yeah.
consume. That's been a 30-year,
Yeah.
arc for me.
For me, when I
So
look at companies like Pearson and Newton, their content is a big part of their brand.
Right. Oh, and actually, this might be a little preciously stated, and others might disagree, but I would say that the content is virtually everything that these companies do. It's packaged in different ways, and the experiences are different,
Hmm.
and the way you move through it might have changed. But ultimately, it is the content that is giving you the knowledge. It's the content that's helping you develop the experiential
Yep.
piece of it. It's giving you the skills
Hmm.
that you want to take away and apply to your job or to your life, what have you. So
Right. Right.
when it comes to intellectual property, which these companies obviously value a great deal. That's the content.
Right.
So yeah, these companies really are all about the content. So the way in which we create that, has made this a really interesting time to be
Yeah.
involved in
Yeah.
anything content related.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because I think it actually almost has two really interesting implications. On the one hand, it's like, how do you use the AI tools yourself? If you are someone who's trying to develop learning products and trying to figure out how to get that content out to the end users, like the tool set changed and how you can think about it and how you can be effective within that tool set has changed. So that's one component. But then the other component is how much of that can now be pointed outward and kind of built into your learning products so it's customer facing. It's both the tooling, we've got an upgrade, but then also the componentry and sort of the underlying technology that powers student facing content and products all got a meaningful upgrade 18 months ago. And then that's why I'd
Okay.
love to
Yeah.
get initial impressions from you on what that ride's been like and if there's anything that's kind of bubbling up now. From my perspective, it does feel like we went through some phases and we're now
Sure.
perhaps maturing a little more, hopefully, but I'd love to get a little bit of your take on it.
Yeah, I would certainly say that there is some maturation, but I think that this journey is very much in its infancy. So I think there's still, a great deal to learn. And one of the ways just in terms of characterizing my own journey is I really try and demystify what this has been like. So to give a little context for anybody who's listening, in my current stint at Magic as part of the curriculum, part of my job, what I'm conscripted to do and what my team of writers and subject matter experts, what we're conscripted to do is, to put it reductively, is write to spec. We will have partners and clients come to us and say, I need a chapter or a lesson or some material on, psychology
Yep.
or mathematics or PowerPoint deck, or, it could either be long form, the modalities of the content we're meant to create very wildly. So the typical and folks who have been in the publishing industry and in ed tech will understand that the typical engagement is we have a client approach us, they tell us this is the kind of content we want. That lands on the ears of the subject matter experts and the editors. We have style guidelines, we have requirements and parameters that we hit. And then we write to spec.
Yep.
We make sure the right people are on there and we engage in the recursive process of drafting, editing, redrafting,
Mm.
and submitting to our client. Now, with the advent of AI coming into our world, that sort of upended everything. Briefly, people were thinking, does this eliminate the need
Yeah.
for subject matter experts? Do we no longer need the human hand in the mix? And
Right.
the way that I've approached it, the way that Magic has approached it, is that we have viewed the people that we have added to my team, and that's the way we've gone about it. I have a team of subject matter experts and writers. What I have done is added to that team engineers and AI architects, and there's sort of a blurry line
Yeah.
between those. But I've added technical folks to the
Mhm.
mix. And what they do in concert with the subject matter experts and writers and myself is they do the very same thing that we were doing previously. They listen to the client, they take in the requirements, they take in who's the audience for this, what does the modality need to be, what are the important metrics, what
Yep.
is the style meant to look like. And instead of putting pen to paper, what they do is put their fingertips to the keyboard and they will, in their parlance, develop a pipeline. And what that ultimately leads to is a code base that
Yep.
can produce drafts. So it really comes down to the first draft is produced through a different mechanism, through a different workflow.
Yeah.
But ultimately, that draft is created. It's then shared with humans who then edit it, respond to it, maybe finesse it. And that goes back to the AI architect or engineer who then recalibrates the code
Yeah.
to address those various edits. And then the recursive process continues to unfold in that way. So really it's not a huge sea change other than the fact that I have added people with different kinds of competencies
Yeah.
to the mix. And that we are now, when those edits are absorbed and responded to, the addition of the code base simply allows us to then generate that content
Mm,
at scale. So we've really added an
I see.
accelerator to the
Right.
mix, but the same iterative, recursive writing process is unfolding. They're just different tools that are in the mix than there used to be.
The evolution of roles is interesting. When something needs to be a new role versus when some of those skills and competencies could be embedded in a role that's changing. Because that's the other, it's a relatively new saw, but it's now old in that AI is not taking your job. Someone using AI is going to take your job. There is an element to that where like almost every type of job should at least ask the question, can these tools help me? But then I think you're taking it a step further to say, okay, now taking a higher level look at the composition of my team, how do we best leverage this technology breakthrough to kind of hit that scale target that you're describing? And if I'm hearing you right, you're saying, one, let's figure out how to code this so that we can crank out a lot, do a lot of
Right.
iterations of it once we get the basic template squared away. And then second, there's almost like a new approach, a new mindset, a new role type around this AI architect. And that's the place maybe we could go next is, why did you land on that language and how would you describe that role? Because that's to me interesting in that you're seeing this kind of potential for exponential scale in some ways, and that really being driven by a new job function for humans.
Right. So, and again, as I characterized earlier in our conversation, I am a civilian in this mix. So I may introduce some infelicities as I
Yeah.
describe the
We're all about
architect.
growth mindset. Bill Imposter syndrome here.
So,
Help yourself out.
the AI architect is really somebody who understands code. It is somebody who has come from an engineering background, is
Yep.
able to write code, and is able to understand. And I don't know what in their schooling helps them understand this, but is able to understand the dynamics and the capabilities of a large language model and is able to, again, write code to produce whatever artifact code is going to produce. In many companies, in many respects, code produces capabilities and experiences. Here, what the code is doing is producing a written artifact. So the people who are on my team, who have joined my team and were actually hired to this company by the engineering group. So their
I see.
engineering competencies were already sussed out and established
Yeah.
when I conscripted them into my team. But yeah, and in terms of their title of architect, for me that's an artistic sort of conceit. They literally create the framework in which the code is going to exist
Mhm.
and enable it to produce the material that it is meant to produce.
The related trope that's out there is humans in the loop. Where do you fit the humans into your system? And that's why, like, taking a step back and almost upgrading your functional org, for lack of a better word, in
Yeah.
response to some of the advantages of AI. It's also interesting around code, where that is a place where resilience and future proofness of coding and some sort of basic development tasks has been brought into question ever since, the LLMs have been hooked into GitLab. And now they become pretty good at basic coding. There is sort of a divide, I think, out there to some extent where some folks are saying, long term, it's going to be more important to be able to communicate with the LLM to get the output of code, but you don't necessarily need to have the code expertise to engage with the LLM to do so. So it's almost like an argument could be had for we need more people kind of in your space, more in the product management space where they're interacting with the AI, which then is outputting the code, which outputs the content. I could see why at this point in time it's a more technical role, but as you start looking at it over a longer span of time, these LLMs should get better at understanding us, in which case I think
Right.
the skills that you need might start to shift.
Yeah, and actually, I think, what you're doing is you're capturing really a moment in time, and the way I'm articulating it is
Mhm.
certainly not going to be immutable. I've
Yeah.
used the word recursive before, and, I think there's going to, by virtue of the recursive nature of how these LLMs learn and how they're trained, there's going to be that increasing democratization of who is able to do what. But to go back to something that you said, in this current sort of human AI dialectic that we have going on to produce content. And in my role, what I have seen, and it's been soothing for those in my sphere for the time being, what I've seen is that the humans are absolutely a critical component of this. And there is often something, there's a few ends to this. There's often the sort of the more ephemeral nature of, the writing process. The models and the AI will produce, prose, and you can engineer it to ape the prose of whatever sort of type of writing you want it to see. But there's still a note of something that's lacking
Yeah.
humanity.
I'm ready to found our startup named Prozape after that expression. That was a nice turn of phrase.
Like I said, kind of letters.
Yeah.
And occasionally I could string them together into coherent thought. But, the humans in the loop, which you've now invoked and will not leave my head, writing in a vaguely, you can almost smell the artificiality that's in it. I often sort of will characterize the writing, despite what you instructed to do. It's almost like an alien who has just learned, the
Yep.
English language and is proving to you that they can use synonyms and polysyllabic words. So there's just something a little precious about that. That'll get better and that'll smooth out over time. What may take longer to smooth out is the hallucinations that AI is still very prone to. And actually, what's been interesting, and I don't know the reasons behind this, but I have noted and others have noted to me that, for instance, it's getting less good at math as we go.
Right.
So the human subject matter experts and writers are here not only to ensure that, the prose and the content that's being written is written in such a way that it's engaging and consumable by the student, regardless of who that student is, but that it's accurate. And again, these are, nobody's going to die if the content is a little askew or
Right.
off.
Right.
But, you know, I take a great deal of pride and put a great deal of importance into the content that we create because we're really training the minds of the next generation. And, a student's success or failure is really going to have such bearing on how they flourish or don't in the rest of their lives.
Right.
So a through line of my career, and I have kept it top of mind with the inclusion of AI into what it is that I do. A through line has always been keeping an eye on making sure that every student who consumes the content that I am responsible for has the equal opportunity to succeed with it.
Yeah.
So the introduction of AI, knowing its hallucinations, knowing its the vagaries of its writing style, knowing that there's some bias that can manifest in it. This dialectic between AI and humans has been a great accelerator,
Mhm.
but there are new things not new things, but things that I am keeping an increasingly sharp eye on, things that I'd always attended to, but now there's sort of an unknown in the mix a little bit.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure that, again, things are accurate, consumable, engaging,
Right.
and unbiased to ensure that, every student has an equal opportunity to succeed when they're engaging.
That's an interesting piece too, where I've heard both sides of the discussion when it relates to equity and access with AI. On the one hand, a lot of the data sets that we don't really know what trained the models, it's not
Right.
explainable all the time, and it's frequently biased, and the hallucinations are even systemically biased at times. All those are known problems. But on the other
Right.
side, in terms of things that used to be scarce, can in the future become abundant. And that's the interesting dimension to the way you're thinking about content generation is that, there needs to be almost like this training window where you have to think about how you design it, get some implementation fidelity around, okay, now let's crank some of this stuff out. It's a new way of thinking, I think, in terms of the way in which a solution might scale. It also opens up a lot of potential. This ties a little bit to your work at Newton in particular.
Right.
There's a lot more potential for personalization now. Content can become
Indeed.
really directly relevant to an individual. Also, universal design for learning and the assistive component of technology where folks who frequently didn't have access to content are going to suddenly have access to it. Can you connect the dots a little bit more on the maybe the equity upside around AI? Because I think we're kind of aware of the challenges and there's real work that's meaningful work that's going to have to be done to kind of clean up the bias and get it working a little bit better. But if you're kind of envisioning a positive future around some of these issues, how do you think it
Eh,
might help?
Yeah, absolutely. I think anything that is able to achieve scale for something that has value and really democratize it. I think that there's a lot of good in that relative to providing equity for folks. That the knowledge that we're transferring or attempting to transfer into the mind, the fact that we're able to scale this less expensively and just distribute it more readily, I think is in its way, a material good. And with anything that is able to achieve scale, regardless of what it is, regardless of what industry or what context you're talking about, you always want guardrails because
Yeah,
there's always, the idea that, too much of a good thing. So you don't want, a runaway train here. But, I think also the capabilities, the access to AI, really enables a student to check their own understanding, to validate various things, to explore further. So they're not just, reliant on, in my old world, students were reliant on the textbook as the corpus of knowledge that they
yeah,
were going to consume and master and move on from,
mhm,
and then, the internet came around and students were able to find different avenues for acquiring
yeah,
that knowledge and that content, and it augmented in many respects the textbook, and then it's really ended up in many respects replacing the
yeah,
textbook. And I think that AI is just a new variant of that. And I ultimately think that, the access to knowledge is in and of itself sort of an unimpeachable, unfettered, unoccluded good. Access to knowledge is just a good thing. But what we want to do as being, stewards of content, I think people in my role and people in roles similar to that, what we want to make sure is that we're just ensuring accurate information is getting out there and is delivered again in a way that is accessible. And we could go down an enormous rabbit hole, I'm sure, relative to what is accurate, for various folks. But, I come from school of thought that, 2 plus 2 equals 4 and facts are verifiable. And so again, another way in which folks had worried that subject matter expertise and writing talent and such would go out the window with AI. And I think that, those roles are going to undergo a little bit of a metamorphosis as we ensure that the content that we're able to get out so much more quickly and with such greater scale, again, is accurate, is
mhm,
doing the job that it's meant to do.
yeah. The thing that struck me, I was listening to the book. Kevin Roos wrote a book called Future Proof, which is pretty interesting. It's kind of like how to stay ahead of this new wave that we're in the midst of. One of the things that he talked about was what he called handprints, which is the idea that a human touched this and signaling that in the product experience so that you have almost a palate cleanser to sort of the coldness of the AI experience. It's almost
Mhm.
like inspected by a human. The idea that some other human shared this experience with you, that and, the uncanny valleys, which is the idea that, we feel unnerved at a point when we're engaging with AI. How are you thinking about the humans in your team and how we're all kind of shook and anxious about this, trying to understand how do I stay relevant? How do I stay adaptable and ahead of this wave? As someone who's leading others and is engaging with folks really across the spectrum, product management, famously, everybody's your boss. How are you thinking about how this is affecting people and, how you can kind of motivate and kind of lead in this context?
To go back to the human touch kind of thing, I tell my clients, I assure my clients, and I, follow that up with actually doing it. I assure my clients that all of the content they get from us is going to have real human DNA as part of it. So my subject matter experts, my writers, they do ensure that accurate content moves through, but that's not just what they're doing.
It's been a great conversation. I'm talking to Eric Stano, who's the Vice President of Consulting Curriculum and Product Strategy at Magic EdTech. I was checking out your blog at Magic EdTech, Eric. It's got some interesting articles out there. I think you've written some articles. We'll include links to that in the show notes. Anything over there that you wanted to touch on as we start to wrap up the conversation here?
Yeah, well, actually, interesting that you bring it up. I just happen to have it open in front of me. There is a relatively new one that's posted, AI for learning development, redefining corporate training. But that is just one example amid many, because AI has really governed a lot of our lives in the last 18 months, and because these blogs are meant to be contemporaneous with innovation and events, what you'll find is that this page is refreshed on a nearly daily basis. So you'll find AI is really the tip of the spear and the bleeding edge of the conversation we're having there.
Fantastic stuff. We'll include links to that in the show notes. And if folks want to reference that, dig in more, you can see what Eric and team at Magic EdTech are working on. As we conclude here, Eric, I always like to give you a chance for some takeaways, some closing remarks for folks they head back to the rest of their lives. Thoughts, ideas you want to get out there in summation?
Yeah, actually, so, as I said at the outset, one of my goals in talking about this again from a semi quasi civilian perspective is to really demystify it and let folks know, or people who are engaged in producing content, developing content, that, in many respects, what you're doing hasn't changed. Some of the people amid your teams might have new competencies, but the process itself just has an accelerator beneath it and some people with some different training. But the process, the recursive, iterative nature of content development remains the same. But there are some new things for folks to think about that I encourage folks to actively explore. One is simply the notion of intellectual property. There are varying schools of thought as to what you own as a company that trammels in intellectual property. If you're generating content using AI, can you copyright that? And again, there have been some relatively choppy waters in these initial days. Not surprisingly, that's one of the reasons that I, as a service provider, ensured that there are humans in the mix really digging into the content. They no longer have the tyranny of the blank page that is slowing their work, but they still have to roll up their sleeves
New risks around, there's some pending, the New York Times has a case
that's right.
pending around intellectual property. It's certainly a space to be keeping an eye on. And then I think you had a second one, right?
Yeah, and actually, it's a related one, which is simply security. LLMs, many companies have now begun to institute their own
Mm.
sort of walled garden style LLM, but you want to make sure that security and privacy concerns, because if you have an author who is, writing in their at their dining room table in the middle of the night and putting pen to paper, security is a little bit less of a concern than if you have content that is being generated from a model, in a large language model. And, that's an entirely different conceit. So it's something that, people who've been in the content business have always been sensitive to intellectual property and the value and security of that. But there's new contexts in which that exists. So I encourage folks to just keep top of mind copyright issues and security issues as they're engaging with the new people who will bring the competencies to the table to use AI in the best way possible to further the endeavors that are already underway.
Fantastic stuff here with Eric Stado, who's the Vice President of Consulting Curriculum and Product Strategy at Magic EdTech. Eric, thanks so much for joining me on today's show.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. I had fun.
And for our listeners, hopefully you enjoyed what you heard. If you did, please subscribe, write us a review, tell your friends, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.